morning for those joining from the United States and countries around it. So welcome to this webinar. I am Intan Ramli from the Economics Research Institute for Asian and East Asia. And I am delighted to moderate this webinar today, hosted by the Hinrich Foundation. Let me provide some context on this webinar. We have seen that foreign direct investment is seen to be having some positive impact in developing economies in areas such as basic infrastructure, clean water, sanitization, and renewable energy. And we see that FDI somehow not only bring capital, but also lead to positive effects on employment, positive productivity growth, innovation, exports, and knowledge and transfer, technology transfer, both directly and through spillovers. But we see somehow that the COVID-19 pandemic has led to a decline of FDI by a staggering 49% in the first half of 2020. The Interagency Task Force on Financing for Development has actually stated with alarm that the international economic and financial systems has somewhat failed to deliver on the SDGs, and there has seen to be substantial backsliding on some key areas. So we see that today, this report will be timely to show that government somehow need to address urgently the decline of FDI and respond with policy reforms that can help to reverse the trend. So today, on this occasion, we have here Professor Simon Evernet, who will present the 27 GTA report, Global Trade Alert Report, which entitled Advancing Sustainable Development with FDI, Why Policy Must Be Reset. Simon is a professor of international trade and MBA director of the University of St. Gallen, Switzerland. He has taught in University of Johns Hopkins, University of Oxford, University of Michigan, and Rutgers University. In addition, he was previously attached to the World Bank, Brookings Institution, and a member of the UK Competition Commission. He also holds a PhD in economics from Yale University and a BA with honors in economics from the University of Cambridge. I will also introduce the discussants who full bio will be in the website. Most of you must be familiar with Eduardo Petrosa, who is the Secretary General of the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council. He has written extensively on regional issues and is a member of the advisory board of the World Economic Forum, Global Risk Report, and the E-commerce expert group. He has also worked for Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, the Economist Intelligence Unit, and the Philippines government. Eduardo graduated from London School of Economics. Also joining the panel discussion is Associate Professor Rob Scottley from Economics faculty of the University of Auckland, which he has joined since 1979. Rob was appointed the director of New Zealand IPAC Forum from 1995, and he's also the coordinator of the PECC Trade Forum and has undertaken consultations for several international organizations and the New Zealand and Australian bodies. So with that introduction, thank you very much to the discussants for joining us today. And before I hand over to Simon, let me bring you to the Q&A feature on the screen. Please feel free to send your question in at any point. Do note that the session is being recorded and the recording is available on Hinrich Foundation website next week. So with the housekeeping out of the way, let me welcome Simon to share with us the findings of the report. Simon, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Intan, for that introduction. I will indeed raise some slides and try and take the discussion forward. Now, in this short presentation, I'm going to make the case that public policy towards foreign direct investment needs to be reset if it's going to make a greater contribution to sustainable development. This presentation is based on the 27th Global Trade Alert Report, which was co-authored with Johannes Fritz, my colleague. This report was also commissioned by the Hinrich Foundation, and we've had a very smooth cooperation with them as we developed and then went forward towards this webinar. So I must thank them as well for this engagement. Now, in the report, we go through a lot of material on foreign direct investment and its numerous contributions. But of course, if there was no problem to fix, there wouldn't be much of a need for a report in the first place. And so what I will show you is where we think that FDI is unfortunately running out of steam, and then what to do about it. So let me move forward then. First, we're highlighting that FDI was a hallmark of globalization once the Berlin Wall fell. I think there's a strong consensus amongst most policy-based economists that FDI can deliver considerably for emerging markets, especially greenfield FDI. For sure, the academics fight over which mechanism is more important. But my take on this, quite frankly, is countries and economies differ, foreign direct investment vehicles differ. Why should we expect to find a similar or common pattern of results from FDI? What matters is that on net, FDI has been positive for developing countries. We have seen as a result a steady inflow of FDI into emerging markets and governments seeking to encourage such inflow. But, and now we can get a little bit to the sting in the tail, as the stock of FDI has built up in emerging markets, we have to recognize that just like any other capital, it depreciates. And if UNCTAD is to be believed, in 2019, there were about $11.5 trillion of capital invested by foreign investors in emerging markets. Standard economics, macroeconomic databases point to capital depreciating at around 4% a year in emerging markets. And so what this means is we need an inflow or a reinvestment of profits of equivalent of about $450 billion every year, just to keep the stock of FDI in emerging markets at its current level. And so essentially we need to see not a zero inflow, but at least 450 billion. Over the last decade, we've seen around 500 to 600 billion, which suggests that the stock of FDI has been rising, but not that quickly. And this really was the first sort of warning signal to us that maybe not everything is quite right with respect to policy towards FDI, because if it was, we'd surely see more such FDI. On top of these considerations, we've seen a number of developments in the last few years, which I think have added to the expectations about what international business is supposed to deliver through all means, not just FDI. We've seen the Sustainable Development Goals, where governments have committed to deliver certain outcomes by 2030. And governments have said that they have neither the resources nor the capabilities to do this on their own, and they're expecting the private sector to contribute. Some international civil society groups have gone further, and they're not just insisting that multinational enterprises contribute, but they should align with, that is, submit to the process of the Sustainable Development Goals. So there's a lot of pressure on international business to be able to deliver. We see in other work like the OECD's FDI Qualities Project that it's not just the volume of FDI that matters now, but also the qualities or the value of it, which is being emphasized. And this highlights the fact that sort of growth-driven FDI is valued, but people want more from it. A third contextual factor, of course, is that as we're recovering from the pandemic, an interesting question is how much can FDI contribute to that recovery? And we may get into that in the discussion. And for two other initiatives, which are much more on the legal side, we have seen countries like Germany introduce rules or legal rules on supply chains being operated by its multinationals around the world. And this is again increasing the burdens on firms that are engaging in international business and may affect their FDI decisions. And recently we saw a sweeping Dutch court judgment against Shell and its global operations as well. So I would argue that discussions of FDI these days have to take account of a changed business climate. In the old days, back in the 90s, there was an unquestioned assumption that more FDI was better. Nowadays, the opinion is a lot more divided on this. And yet, so it's worth, I think, going back and looking at what are the underlying FDI dynamics and can we take FDI for granted? The bottom line on that question is no. What we find is that if you benchmark FDI inflows against sensible global aggregates like world GDP, the total level of all forms of investment and world trade, you'll find that FDI inflows have been growing slower than all of those three items. And so what we have seen since the global financial crisis is a trend reduction in FDI inflows as compared to these benchmarks, or as I said earlier, FDI, to the extent that it's growing, is growing much slower than world GDP, world trade, and world investment. So there seems to be something going wrong, or to put it differently, business seems to be committing less money to FDI inflows and to reinvesting the profits from existing overseas operations. Now, why could that be? Well, I think one of the things we do in the report, which is quite distinctive, is to argue that FDI is the result of business decisions. Businesses are not charities. And if the return on FDI starts falling, then we should not be surprised that companies seek other ways to enter global or international markets. So in the report, we use very fine-grained US data, where the United States collects very high-quality financial statement data on the overseas operations of its multinationals. And from that, we can see what the return on those overseas operations are. That is the net income divided by the capital invested. And what we check in the report is whether or not emerging market regions earn premium returns over those in the European Union. And the reason we check for a premium is because it's typically argued that emerging markets are riskier, and so they need to earn a higher level of return to compensate investors for that risk. Well, as this chart shows, once you get beyond 2015, which is the era when the Sustainable Development Goals were introduced, we find that there is no discernible premium on FDI returns in Africa, the Asia Pacific, and in Southern and Central America. So any premium has been eliminated by then. Furthermore, the premium in the Middle East has collapsed as oil prices collapsed in that region. So what we're seeing then is that US firms, if they want to essentially maximize their returns without taking on too much risk, they could invest in the European Union. They have little incentive to invest elsewhere. Now, you may ask, why am I focusing on US FDI? The US is the only country that makes public detailed data on the returns on its FDI. There are United Nations estimates on the returns on FDI, but these come from noisy balance of payments data, which the International Monetary Fund puts together, and are regarded then as useful, but not as, I think, as valuable as this type of information. So the first big finding is, and the first suggestion is, that maybe the reason FDI inflows are falling compared to the growth of world trade and the like is because the returns on FDI are falling in emerging markets, and that can't be good. There's often a lot of attention in the Asia Pacific on FDI into China, and so the natural question arises, do we see the same pattern there? Well, the answer is yes and no. We see in US FDI in China earns premium returns over that of the European Union and worldwide, but that premium has been falling over time. So the pattern of declining returns is also found in US investments in China as well. So again, we have the same problem. When we look across sectors of the economy, we find that there are some heavy income and employment generating sectors which are still generating very nice returns. So the returns from manufacturing, wholesale trade, retail trade, these are at levels which are quite healthy, in particular for manufacturing. And that's good news. So the story is not one of entirely of bad news. But for those people who are interested in the Sustainable Development Goals per se, if they're interested in the returns in telecommunications investments, healthcare investments, agricultural investments, and educational services, these returns are extremely low, and certainly below the average earned by US firms worldwide. And so an interesting question is why that is. In some cases, that may be because the foreign firms, the foreign investors are competing against publicly provided service providers who are subsidized, but there may be other reasons too. But it certainly cannot be good news that the payback period for an American investment in a healthcare area is, in the most recent years, about 90 years. That's just far too long for any type of serious private sector participation. So the concern is then that FDI in Sustainable Development Goal sensitive sectors returns are very low, and that this may well help us account for why some people in New York and around the United Nations are worried about businesses' contributions to the Sustainable Development Goals, and maybe the answer is because returns in those investments are so low to start with. So that's our first set of findings. When we turn next to, well, okay, why are the returns on FDI so low? Then we dug into the policy changes facing foreign direct investors. And what we've seen is a deterioration in the last 5 years in the share of policies which are conducive to FDI. And so here we dug into the Global Trade Alert database, where we took account of changes in policies towards the establishment of foreign firms, changes in the treatment of foreign firms after they've established facilities, changes in localization measures, and changes in trade policies which could induce tariff jumping FDI. And what we find is that if you go back almost 8 or 9 years, that 55% or more of all policy changes every year were supportive of FDI. And that share has now fallen down to around 40 to 45%, as we show in this particular chart. So policy has moved in an adverse direction towards FDI. Now, UNCTAD, which has just recently released its very useful World Investment Report, they too report in recent years worsening treatment of FDI, but their share of policies which are conducive to FDI is typically higher. So their starting point is higher, but they too show a deterioration, at least in the last couple of years. We would argue that when you take a broader canvas of the policies that are relevant, this decline has been setting in for some time. In other words, it's not a pandemic-driven story. The rot started a lot earlier. So policy has been turning against FDI, especially in the service sectors. So we find that in both goods sectors and service sectors, policy is getting less and less conducive to FDI, but it was always less conducive to FDI in the service sectors. And that's important because most of our economies are becoming more service sector dominated. So as our economies transform toward being more service sector dominated, essentially the aggregate policy mix facing FDI is getting less and less friendly. And so this is a further reinforcement of what of the main finding I showed you 2 slides ago. On top of all of this, we have the important contribution that geopolitics is playing. And we have seen since 2015, a large number of countries, including almost all of the major economies of the world, and many in East Asia and the Asia Pacific, introducing or strengthening so-called FDI screening mechanisms. Now, ostensibly, these FDI screening mechanisms are supposed to keep out investments that threaten national security or critical infrastructures. But the problem is so many of these screening mechanisms have been written in a far too broad manner, and they've not been implemented in a way which is particularly transparent. And it's not clear what the theory of harm is that the investigators are using. For all these reasons, this is adding to the uncertainty faced by foreign investors and probably deterring them as well. We also have reports increasingly coming from the Asia Pacific region that although these FDI screening mechanisms were set up to target Chinese FDI, outward FDI, in fact, the laws were written in a way which covers all inward FDI, and other forms of inward FDI, non-Chinese, are being influenced as well. So we have a further sort of geopolitical wrapper to add on to this. So let me put the story together then. FDI inflows have been falling compared to other sensible benchmarks, or at least put it this way, FDI inflows have not grown as much as world GDP. There is a growing reluctance of private sector firms to make these investments and to reinvest abroad. We suspect that that has a lot to do with the falling returns to FDI in emerging markets, and that the falling returns in FDI coincide with policy becoming more and more adverse towards FDI. So how do we fix this? Well, the goal really of policy is to be as follows. If we want FDI to contribute more to sustainable development, then FDI has to recover its commercial viability. So there are 3 things which should happen. First, we need to target and track and monitor the commercial viability of FDI. If anybody in the audience has this assumption that firms, multinational firms, make huge amounts of money in emerging markets and that there is a healthy cushion to eat into, then this report should make you think again. So clearly we have overlooked the FDI returns and instead just focused on policies which we think have been more conducive to FDI, we need to see that those policy changes translate into greater commercial viability. Secondly, to the extent that FDI is supported with financial measures by governments, either by the host country or the outward country, that is the country exporting the capital, then those financial incentives should be targeted towards development-sensitive sectors. And the host country should designate what those sensitive sectors are. And third, we need to go back to the drawing board and de-risk FDI. The incredible regulatory momentum that we have seen over the past decade, including these new investment screening mechanisms, need to be reviewed to be able to see whether we can limit the amount of uncertainty being faced by foreign investors. So these are 3 do's. One clear don't is don't try and artificially increase the commercial returns on FDI by raising trade barriers, because this has all sorts of other adverse byproducts, which are typically extremely anti-development. For example, increasing tariffs on medicines and medical goods as a way of boosting the FDI returns in those sectors would come at the cost of hospitals, public health budgets, and individuals' well-being. So that's exactly the type of thing we should not be doing. Focus on the 3 do's, and not on the artificial solution, which is to raise trade barriers instead. Let me stop there and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's the system. Thanks, Simon. It's really good to hear the reset policy that you have proposed for the government to actually take up in order to actually promote more investment into countries. Of course, I normally see that what investors normally want is that they want the tax rates, ease of payment, technological and innovation availability, and R&D capabilities and efficiency in the legal and the regulatory processes. So those are the main 4 ones. Of course, there are many, which I shall not explain here. But before that, I would like to also, again, remind everyone to share your questions, if you have any for Simon, to the Q&A feature. And now I would like to invite Rob to provide his comments.
Thank you very much, Intan. Much appreciated. And to begin with, let me first of all say that, as always, we owe a great debt of gratitude to Simon and the Global Trade Alert for this report, which embodies all the features that we've come to expect from them. The extensive and, most importantly, the critical use of publicly available data, including in this case that really valuable data set at the US Department of Commerce's Bureau of Economic Affairs, which, as Simon pointed out, has mysteriously remained undisturbed by researchers until now, plus Global Trade Alert's own unique and comprehensive data set on new policy measures around the world, which is one huge contribution that they make to international trade and investment policy analysis. And as always, the report identifies the key policy issues, how they are illuminated by the data, it's evidence-based, and shows the willingness to ask the most awkward and relevant questions and not shy away from awkward conclusions, all of the things we've come to expect from Simon and the Global Trade Alert. And of course, the picture that the report paints is really stark. At a time when there's widespread recognition of the need for increased private sector involvement to deliver investments needed to support sustainable development objectives, including critically the climate change objectives. And of course, in the Asia Pacific region, we've been hearing for years similar calls in relation to meeting infrastructure deficits, as Eduardo well knows. In sensible relative terms, FDI has been on a clear downward trend for the last decade, and that's only been accelerated by the COVID pandemic, particularly inward FDI in developing countries. Worse, the proportion of new FDI flowing into sustainability sensitive activities, including those related to climate change targets, has been disappointing, and the proportion flowing into the services sector, except for distribution services, has also been disappointing. I think the key point on which the analysis in the report hangs is the recognition, which we may have forgotten, that investors, including foreign direct investors, need an expectation of an adequate rate of return to justify their investment. But the risk-adjusted rates of return observed in developing countries are low and likely insufficient to attract the desired levels of FDI. And I think it's worth highlighting how big a change this is in the perceptions that we have had of foreign direct investment in developing countries. In the report, Simon refers to the work of people like Raymond Verman, where some of us knew many years ago, and contributed to a climate of opinion that suggested that foreign direct investors make excessive returns from their investments in developing countries. This report makes it clear that if that was the case in the past, it is no longer the case today. And that's probably something that a change in perception that is going to be quite important in the way that foreign direct investment is perceived going forward. Just to conclude my remarks, I would like to look at this issue through a trade lens. And in that connection, I'd like to say that the disappointing trade of foreign direct investment in services industries is particularly concerning. I think we've all realized in recent years that services, which are a steadily increasing share of output in nearly all economies, that in the digital age, they're going to be increasingly central to driving the productivity improvements and the associated income increases in modern economies. To look at this through the trade lens, I think it's relevant to note that restrictions in FDI on services have been ongoing for almost 3 decades in multilateral and regional negotiations on services trade, where Mode 3, or commercial presence, essentially consists of foreign direct investment in services and is by far the largest services trade flow that's covered in all these negotiations. Research has made it clear that for nearly 3 decades of various services trade negotiations, these negotiations have produced depressingly little in the way of genuine liberalisation. Many economies continue to make commitments on services trade involving levels of restrictiveness that are greater than their actual policies. And the reasons for these disappointing outcomes lie deep in the political economies of individual countries, and these issues have to be addressed somehow if we're going to improve the outcome of services trade negotiations. Innovative approaches to improving these outcomes continue to be made. For example, in our region, in APEC, the APEC Services Competitiveness Roadmap, and Simon's report, I think, is a very salutary reminder of the magnitude of what is at stake in these endeavours. Just one point I perhaps would highlight as well is that we have at the moment an ongoing debate on international taxation, and I wonder what the likely impact on the risk-adjusted rates of returns is going to be of the outcome of that debate. I think that's something to remember. And also in relation to climate change, decarbonisation is going to require substantial structural change in most economies, which is going to have important implications for the investment needed for the future. And taking the key lesson from this report into to heart, if investors are going to make the necessary investments for this purposes, they're going to need to be confident of the commercial and regulatory environment in which these investments are going to be profitable. And we need to think about what needs to be done in terms of international policy towards foreign direct investment that will help to ensure this. And I'll stop there as well. Thank you. And I believe I now introduce or pass the floor over to Ed Pedrosa, my friend and colleague from the PECC, for his comments. Thanks, Ed.
Well, thank you very much, and my congratulations go to Simon and Johannes for really an excellent report. It's a tremendous contribution once again to the literature, and many thanks to the Hinrich Foundation for the invitation to be here. My comments really come from the Asia Pacific perspective, but let me begin by saying that this report once again really shows the value and the importance of monitoring government policy, and this is something that the Global Trade Alert really does and contributes tremendously to public policy discourse. I'll begin with sort of my takeaways from the report, and just to say that FDI really does play a vital role in achieving sustainable development. Annual inflows of FDI as a percentage of GDP, gross capital formation and trade, have been in decline since the global financial crisis. I did have a look to see if this was a global trend or something that was, and if it's true for our region, and yes, it is true for the Asia Pacific as well. Returns on FDI have been falling, especially in emerging markets, and it's a sort of a little bit depressing that it's true for the development sensitive sectors, that government policies tend to favor FDI in manufacturing over services, and that businesses have faced mounting regulatory risks over the past decade. And I guess the basic conclusion I took away from the report, that something really does have to change if we are to achieve the SDGs. My comments are in three sort of main parts. First, I wanted to comment on the bias of FDI policy against services, on the drop in FDI flows, what can we expect moving forward? And thirdly, the policy headwinds, how important are they from a business perspective? Are there other factors that businesses consider? And how well do economies in the Asia Pacific measure up against these sort of factors? And lastly, I wanted to round off my comments looking forward on whether there is some sort of cause for hope. I have some slides I wanted to sort of share with you, if I can get them to work. Go. Great. Let me begin with the SDGs, and I wanted to be completely honest with you that I have a really hard time remembering all 17 of them, let alone the 232 indicators. And I'm very thankful for Simon for putting them into the report. And I'll confess that it's much easier to remember the 6 transformations that someone very clever, much cleverer than me, came up with. And just a quick reminder, sort of education, gender and inequality, health, well-being and demography, energy, decarbonization and sustainable industry, sustainable food, land, water and oceans, sustainable cities and communities, and the digital revolution for sustainable development. And when I think about it that way, it really does dawn on me that pretty much all 6 transformations, all of them involve services in some form or another. And a few years ago, when we were beginning the work on services in the region, we did this survey, and we asked our sort of the regional policy community about the importance of services to a few things. We asked, how important do you think an efficient services sector is to your economy? And you can see here, large, 44% of respondents thought that services were extremely important for innovation. 41% thought they were extremely important for economic growth. 36% thought they were extremely important for generating employment, but 24% thought they were extremely important for inclusivity. And if I think about things that way, it seems that, well, we've come a long way, I think, in having a better understanding of the role of services in our economy. We don't quite make that connection between services and inclusiveness, but I think the way Simon explains it, health, education, these are all services. So we really need to change our mindsets a little bit in understanding what services are and how important they are for achieving the SDGs. If we're going to achieve them and get companies to invest in achieving the SDGs, that's sort of one sort of point that I wanted to make. And especially, I think, Rob, you made the point about climate change as well. Those are effectively services that we talk about. The second set of points I wanted to pick up from the report was about the decline in FDI flows. And one thing we talk a lot about in the PEC reports more generally is sort of capital expenditure, and what we look at. The chart on the left is capex. So this is the sort of the global numbers, and what you see is before the global financial crisis, we had pretty solid capex, but after the GFC it was really quite dismal. So this sort of caused the G20 finance ministers to say in 2019 that, you know, one of the factors underlying sort of excessive imbalances may include excessive corporate savings. There were deep sort of concerns and debates about these issues. So if you just sort of focus, if you like, on expectations in 2019 about corporate capex for 2020 and 2021, expectations were negative. There was sort of, people didn't expect corporate capex to go anywhere looking forward. But then if you sort of turn your sort of eyes to the chart on the right, at the moment, expectations are that the corporate sector is going to start spending again. And that's sort of quite a shift in the mindset of the corporate sector. So something sort of happened on the side of the businesses. Now, does that mean that FDI is going to start to flow? I think if we take Simon's conclusions, that not necessarily. The latest UNCTAD report says probably not. A lot of this expenditure will stay at home. I think the UNCTAD report says that of the top 5,000 non-financial listed multinational enterprises, they have cash holdings of about $8 trillion. There's a lot of money swishing around in the system, but what's going to really happen? We don't actually know the answer to that question. But as you can see there, the corporate sector is willing to spend money, and they're going to spend money, a lot of money on communications, IT, and so on. But will it result in FDI flows into specific sectors? You know, the jury is still out. I did try and have a look at what's, you know, if there has been any FDI flows into the region. We hear anecdotal stories. For example, the US private equity firm KKR recently raised $13 billion for an Asia-focused fund. They're quite bullish about the region for SDG specific issues. They invested $685 million in a hospital chain in the Philippines, $650 million in homes in Vietnam, and they also took a shareholding in a telecoms firm in the Philippines. So there's stuff happening. It's all quite anecdotal. Will it solve all of the SDGs in the region? The answer is not quite there. But I raise these anecdotal stories because it would be interesting to drill down and see what happened, what were the expected rates of return on these projects, so that we have a much better sense of what's going on. The telecom sector invested $180 billion in telecom networks infrastructure in 2019. They want to invest, they expect to invest $1.1 trillion in network infrastructure over the next 5 years, but they do say that governments and regulators need to provide the best possible enabling environment by providing and ensuring pro-investment, pro-innovation policies that reduce costs and uncertainty around spectrum allocation and assignments, and remove obstacles to network deployment and adopt international best practices and tax policy. So they are concerned about the policy front. So lots and lots of concerns from the private sector, but they do have lots of money to invest. So what do investors care about? And this brings me to my sort of third set of points. So the chart on the left comes from A.T. Kearney's 2021 FDI confidence index. First of all, generally, A.T. Kearney's comments are that the investor community remains quite pessimistic. There's a lot of scarring out there in the business community. They don't expect a lot of FDI to take place. They come to the same conclusions that Simon comes to, that the most attractive destinations for FDI remain advanced market economies. The US, Canada, and Germany top the list. What they do care about, tax, technological and innovation capabilities, R&D, and so on. Of the 19 factors that they have, 11 were market factors, and 8 were governance and regulatory factors. On the right, I tried to sort of find the index that matches most of the sort of factors here, which is the Wipo Innovation Index scores. So it was sort of interesting to see how Asia-Pac economies do. We don't do that badly on a lot of these factors. Singapore, out of this region, scores the most highly on these. China does particularly well. Japan, of course, Korea does quite well. But these are sort of static scores. There are economies moving up. The GII shows India, Vietnam, China, and the Philippines moving up the index scores. And that's probably why we've seen some investment flows moving into these economies. On sort of my last sort of set of points is on sort of global and regional initiatives. APEX just adopted its Putrajaya vision. These are successors to the Bogle goals. It has 3 economic drivers: trade and investment, innovation and digitization, strong, balanced, secure, and sustainable and inclusive growth. So the hope is that APEC will come up with a work program that hopefully will align a policy agenda that drives initiatives that will help economies to shift some of its work towards addressing some of the concerns Simon has addressed. APEC has had an investment facilitation action plan in place since 2008 that addressed some of the underlying concerns Simon has identified. APEC had its non-binding principles for domestic regulation of services. Hopefully, as economies implement some of the best practices there, we'll see some improvements on the policy side. APEC just adopted its agenda for structural reforms, which should lead to some improvements on the ease of doing business side, sort of a better sort of policy outlook for businesses. There are WTO initiatives on services, domestic regulation, the WTO Joint Statement Initiative on investment facilitation. Rob, you already mentioned the G7 global tax minimum. There's a lot going on in the region. Will it make a bit of difference? I guess the one thing we could say is they really don't address the big thing that Simon has said in his comments, is they really don't talk about the commercial viability of investments. And I think I'll end my comments here, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ed. Wow, that's like really a painting of a very stark situation that we are hearing here. I mean, like, it is very imperative that the government actually have really a good thinking about how to do the reset and how to promote the private sectors to come in. Because of course, we see questions here, and I would like to invite more questions to come in as I speak. Maybe if I could start the first question to Simon first. Maybe having found that this kind of situation where governments are actually now having a lot of difficulty dealing with the COVID situation, how would you then propose to government to restart their investment inflows to somehow help the firms and society adapt to the downturn and ensuring that the investment flows make the maximum contribution to the SDG? So Simon, could you answer that?
Certainly, I'll try. I mean, I think COVID is important for so many reasons, but perhaps one of the most important things when thinking about policy reform is we have all gone through incredible changes in the last year, and the types of policy interventions we've seen in the last 15 months would have been regarded as completely impossible 2 or 3 years ago in terms of intervention on both economic side as well as into people's private lives and the like. And so I think we are actually in an era where you can think the unthinkable and actually going back to the drawing board and asking, okay, if we wanted foreign investors to make an important contribution to the healthcare systems of our country, how could we do this? What partnerships would be useful in this regard? And furthermore, I think it's also a good opportunity to go to look across all of government and to all of the different regulators which are out there all of whom I'm sure are trying to do the best they can, and to ask whether the cumulative effect of all of their actions is actually discouraging both domestic as well as foreign investment as well. And then I think, as has been highlighted by Rob and others, there are important tax discussions which are going to be unfolding over time. And the estimates I've seen suggest that actually the amount of tax which will be redistributed and paid to different governments is actually going to be quite low. But still, I mean, it's a good opportunity for a country to step back and ask, right, what is the best structure for taxation of businesses, both domestic and foreign, quite frankly, going forward. And I think the other area we've really got to rethink is we have to challenge this assumption that we can keep piling on obligations on international business. And I think Rob made a really good point when he reminded us that Ray Vernon and others had for years, the presumption was that businesses were making out like bandits in developing countries. I wonder now if that's still true. And I don't doubt that there may be examples. But if it turns out that the markets have become a lot more competitive and returns on FDI are falling, then there's a lot less cream to be redistributing around. And I think this might force a bit of a rethink as well.
Thank you, Simon. Can I invite Rob? There's a question in the question box on why actually the government changed the policy on services sector or another sector against the FDI. Can you deal with that?
Okay, thank you. Well, this is something that's been going on in the trade field for many, many years. As I mentioned, we've had trade negotiations going back to the late 1980s on services trade designed to try and reduce or eliminate restrictions on services trade. And frankly, the results have been extremely disappointing. And I think the reason has always been that the political economy and the countries involved in these negotiations have been such that governments have been really reluctant to actually make the not just the commitments, but to actually commit to the actual changes that are needed to reduce restrictions on services trade. And there's really simply just getting into a negotiating route to try and deal with this has just proved, I think, to be a very disappointing, have very disappointing results. And ways have had to be found to try to convince governments that if they actually do take action on this area and freeing up restrictions on services trade, that the results are actually going to be beneficial, not just economically, but also that they're not going to be disastrous politically for the governments concerned that make these. And so you really have to get build a consensus around the changes that are needed in services trade restrictions, talking about best practices, talking about innovative ways of dealing with this, to actually get the kind of conviction among governments that they can move forward in this area and really make progress. And I think, to me, that's one of the strengths of the APEC approach to this kind of issue, that it really does focus firstly on building the consensus among the economies concerned before you expect that they're going to take action. And that's really the whole motivation behind APEC's services competitiveness roadmap that the APEC economies are working on, and will hopefully produce some worthwhile results going forward. But basically, I think services trade, and in particular the element of services trade that involves foreign direct investment in services trade, has always been a fraught issue in trade negotiations.
Thank you, Rob. I'd like to ask Simon next. What do you think the cause for the fall in FDI returns in emerging markets in the recent years?
So I think the answer here is best broken down into two parts.
Yeah.
On the revenue side, we are seeing much more competition in emerging markets, and we see a lot more cross-border trade as well, if you think in structural terms over the last decade or so. So it wouldn't surprise me if in many markets now prices and monopoly power are being pushed down, and so this would depress returns, and that's a natural, and I would say quite frankly, a positive process to some degree. We have also seen, I think, in a number of emerging markets, rising costs, and in particular rising labor costs, and we can point to economies in East Asia, where that's very much the case. And so you may be getting a margin squeeze, a profit margin squeeze from the competition side, product market competition side, and labor cost side. I would then, and again, I think, again, what I'm about to say now is very, very contingent on which economy you're looking at. Also asking whether or not regulatory burdens have been growing too quickly and eating into the returns as well. So I think these are the considerations I would look at if I was breaking this out even further.
Thank you. Ed, can you answer the second question, which is if the host country designates certain sustainable development sectors for investment or financial support, wouldn't that exacerbate the problem?
That's a tough question to answer. I mean, you'd hope that it would crowd in private investment, but I'm not. I mean, that I think Simon gets into some of that in the report. I mean, there are going to be pluses and minuses to this process that I'm not entirely clear on personally, whether or not financially supporting that is going to be a beneficial process. What we're looking for is a policy environment that really encourages private sector investment with a beneficial rate of return over a long haul, and making sure that we've got these projects or these investments that really are in for the long haul, that are beneficial to the recipient economy. That's what I think I'd really like to see come out of this entire process. I mean, having an investment that's there because of an incentive, I'm not quite sure that's what we need. PPPs, public-private partnerships, I think those can be very useful. Incentives, I'm a little bit unsure. I don't know if Simon has a particular view on this.
So look, Ed's nervousness reflects, I think, a very well-established sort of sense amongst the policy economists in this area that if we all had our way, I suspect we'd like to get rid of all FDI incentives because they do distort the playing field. But we do have to understand that they're not going away, in which case we should ask the question, where should they be applied? And if they can be applied in sectors where there's high levels of uncertainty for other reasons, or where there's enormous societal payoffs which are non-economic, non-business related, then that probably makes some sense. But I think I would also want to highlight, and I'm not sure Ed would disagree, that government should not count on targeted incentives as the solution to these problems. We need a sort of a broader review, as I argued, of the many different policies which affect the commercial viability of FDI. And in the context of that, looking at incentive reforms, incentives make sense.
I think I just want to add on that. I think I've seen some countries actually doing studies where they have seen that incentives is actually not the sole reason for investors to come into a country. And I think a lot of developing economies are now learning that it is not that, and they are actually revising their policies to actually be more attractive in terms of to make sure that investors are actually coming in not for just the incentive, but more in terms of cooperation and recognition as well internationally as a good governance kind of effort. So those are the things that I've seen so far. Another question, Simon, I think there's one. It says here that we see an acceleration of digital technologies being applied to the manufacturing and services sectors. Will this have an impact on the declining trend in FDI flows to the Asia-Pacific region?
I think it's very, very dangerous to generalize here, because surely one of the things we've seen over the past 10 years is the many different ways in which businesses can use digital technologies. To the extent that companies do not need to shift capital across borders now to be able to finance digital investments abroad, or to the extent that local firms can set up business with much more lighter capital light models, then we may end up seeing essentially a reduced demand for foreign direct investment. Indeed, one of the interesting reactions I got last week in presenting this report to colleagues from the World Economic Forum was that their sense was that the demand for FDI was falling precisely because digital technologies had changed the capital needs of some lines of business. But again, I caution against overgeneralizing, but I would also caution, I would also suggest that this is probably part of the story. That is, the spread of digital technologies is probably an important contributing factor.
Yes.
It's interesting when looking at some of the capex numbers, is that those who have actually big plans to invest are the big digital companies, you know, like Alphabet, Alibaba, Microsoft, and so on. I guess one of my sort of, I guess I'm still slightly optimistic that where we might see some investments in some of the SDG sectors like education and healthcare is where you get that combination. So when you might get investment in health tech and ed tech, and that make these sectors slightly more profitable, where there is an internal rate of return, because these are businessmen. So you saw the sort of the KKR investment in the Vietnamese ed tech company and so on, and that's where that might change the dynamic of the investment equation. So that's where it becomes slightly more interesting, and the idea of the unprofitable consumer changes, if you like. So that's my contribution.
Yeah. So one last question before we wrap up is that the role of IIAs, is there, I mean, any of you would like to contribute in terms of whether there's a need to revamp the IIAs to actually include provisions that is conducive towards sustainable development? Simon?
Rob, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sorry, could you repeat the question? I didn't hear exactly one aspect of.
Investment agreements play some part in attracting FDI. To what extent should there be a revamp of these agreements to further sustainable development friendly investment?
So the question is about investment agreements. Well,
yes.
As I see it, what investment agreements are basically doing is providing an increased level of certainty for the investors, both in terms of their entry into markets and also how they're going to be treated once they've established themselves. And I don't think that purpose of an investment agreement is going to change. Whether they need to be revamped, I think it's really hard to say. I think you probably have to go agreement by agreement. We've seen some quite big changes in terms of some countries wanting to exit from their investment agreements. But I think for a country that wants to attract foreign direct investment, the provision of a degree of certainty to investors is still going to be really important. And I see that as the principal purpose of an investment agreement from the point of view of the receiving country.
Okay, one last word from each of you on how you would like to see FDI in this region.
So maybe I can start. I mean, I do think FDI has a future in advancing development, and even if you want to focus on sustainable development as well. I think what's happened is that a number of assumptions have been brought to bear on FDI policy, which are probably not factually accurate anymore. And perhaps the most important of which is that FDI has a very high level of commercial return. And if that's no longer the case for a number of reasons, we need to figure out what those reasons are and how many of them are structural and how many of them are policy related. Because if we want to bring in foreign expertise, foreign management capabilities, we want to see those disseminate through local economies and through supply chains, then I think we need to make sure that the people undertaking those investments have some sense that they're likely to get their money back.
Rob?
I actually completely agree with what Simon has just said, and I think the other aspect of it is that there's obviously a very high degree of uncertainty being created within this region, maybe also other regions in the world, by the geopolitical developments, which have really, I think, been completely unhelpful in many different respects, including in terms of their effects on foreign direct investment. And I mean, it's really depressing to people like me, that, and I've no doubt others as well, to watch the principal protagonists in this situation really engaging in behaviour that is obviously harmful for the region and the world as a whole, but is also directly harmful to themselves. And I think I would really like to see some change there, although I'm not particularly optimistic that it's going to occur in the short term.
And finally, to add?
I think I agree with that. And I think finding the right architecture to have this conversation about making that business case is going to be important. Whether you do that bilaterally or in a regional context is quite an important discussion to have. I mean, both you and I work for regional organizations.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of benefit in doing this in a regional context, so you can get that sort of cross-fertilization of ideas. So we can learn, say, from Vietnamese, Indonesian, Philippine case studies, rather than doing that on a bilateral basis where investors might be a little bit more sort of weary of speaking. You can get a sort of a more neutral platform for having that discussion about what is the rate of return businesses look for. So maybe that's something, Simon, that we can take forward, thinking about the future and getting businesses to actually come forward and telling us what they do expect in this current environment.
Okay, finally, we come to the end part of this webinar. Thank you very much, Simon, for your excellent report and presentation today. Rob and Eduardo, for your excellent panel discussion, and to the audience for your active participation. I hope that the sharing of this is useful. And please note that the webinar link, the webinar recording and related links will be provided on the www.hinrichfoundation.com next week. And especially if you need to have the latest insights on sustainable global trade. Thank you for participating. Hope to see you soon and stay safe.